Hey guys, it's Zach with ZWR Woodshop, and today I'm going to be making a small side table out of my least favorite wood, and that's oak. However, this oak is seriously so beautiful. It's got some amazing grain figuring that just really stood out to me right when I saw it. I knew I had to do something with it, and it's taken probably a year or two now for it to finally happen. But here it is. I apologize for the video orientation. I was going to make a TikTok video, but then I decided I'd rather try YouTube, especially with the TikTok bans possibly going to happen. But right around the 4 minute mark, I changed the orientation so it's a little bit better for YouTube. And I don't know if you can tell, but I've been having some jointery issues as I've been preparing this top. So I tried out the track saw method where you just take a little bit off of both sides. And for whatever reason, that didn't work either. So I just tried clamping it up without any glue to see if I could get all of the gaps out, and still didn't work. So I figured, you know what, why not just get it a little bit closer to the final dimensions because the stock was oversized as is, and I didn't want to have to take off about, I think it was about half an inch worth of material that I'd have to remove with my router sled instead of the planer. So I just figured that that was a better option. After doing that, I decided to move on to the base and just kind of think through a different process for the top. I found that oftentimes if I take a break, that just in the meantime, I figure out something else that'll work. For the base, I decided to go with walnut. I really like tables that have two different wood types, one that's an accent to the top, and I feel like walnut does really good with oak, honestly, especially this beautiful oak top. It's going to look amazing. So I get it all milled down to its approximate dimensions, and then I'm actually going to cut out some templates on my laser. And I love having a laser for this exact reason, is it makes it so easy for really odd shaped pieces to easily route them out with a template bit. As you can see here, I'm just marking it out, getting it ready so that I can bring it over to the table saw, trim it down, and then eventually over to the bandsaw as well. And I would highly, highly recommend to any wood shop to invest in a laser, a 3D printer, or a CNC. Now, I don't think you need all three of them, but any of those can make repeatable templates that make a process like this, where you're cutting an odd shaped piece, a lot easier and make it repetitive as well and super precise. So I finally got it through the bandsaw here, and I brought it over to my router table. And to be honest, this router table sucks. It's more the router, honestly. Just adjusting the depth. I have to get in there with like a set of channel locks and pretty much undo it so that I can adjust the depth, but that is all on the back, so I have to pull it out. It's just a pain. So if you're looking for a router table, look for one that's easy to adjust. Makes a world of difference, trust me. Right now I'm just taking the side posts and trimming them down to their final height so that it will all be ready for being on the router table, and I have to take a little bit off of the inside. Eventually I'm going to come in and I'm going to round over all of these edges, but I want to make it a smooth transition from the bottom to the side and then up to the top. And so once again, I bring it over to the bandsaw and I cut fairly close to my guide that I already marked out on there so that I'm not trying to take off like almost an inch worth of material with my router table. You really want to take off like no more than an eighth of an inch. And even that's a little bit heavy. But once again, love the laser for being able to design and almost immediately duplicate these all to be the exact same. And this is just a little bit of my process where I like to use either super glue or I have some like double-sided woodworking tape, and that works amazing. Sadly, I didn't do very good on this particular leg. I don't think you can see it in the video, but I actually get some tear out. You'll see it in a couple of minutes when I have to go in and fix it. But before I do that, I decided to kind of assemble a couple parts of the base, not quite everything quite yet. Right now would be a great time to have a domino machine. That would be awesome, but I don't have $1,500 to go buy a domino machine, but I did have $25 to buy this little dowel jig from the Home Depot. And honestly, it worked out pretty good. I was pretty happy with the results that I got from it. It wasn't perfect by any means, but for $25, I feel like I got more than what I paid for. And it made everything just line up a little bit smoother, less sanding in the long run, which, as we all know, is a game changer. And of course, after I got everything glued up, I realized I wanted the outside corners to also be curved, just to kind of give everything a curved effect, no sharp corners, and I just feel like it'll work out better with these roundovers. And here is that corner that I accidentally tore out, and it was 100% my fault. The wood wouldn't have done that if I weren't being stupid. But you know what? I was actually a little bit excited about this. I mean, most of the good woodworkers that you see out there, like Blacktail Studios or Four Eyes, like one way that they really set themselves apart is by being able to correct these types of mistakes without costing lots of money. And especially since I didn't have a client that I was selling this to specifically, it's just kind of build it to build it type of thing. It was an opportunity for me to test out being able to fix a mistake like this. And it wasn't perfect, but I feel like I did a pretty good job with trying to figure out the grain pattern and coloring to match up the best and preparing it in general. Then I glued it in, and like I said, I think it turned out pretty good. It's definitely visible, but I was able to hide it as best as I feel like I could, and I gained the experience of being able to say that I can fix problems like these. And once again, I brought it over to, well, I guess this time I brought the router over to it with the template. And that was mostly because I'd already set up the router table for a future step that I didn't want to have to undo just to redo. So I just used my little handheld, and it worked pretty good. Next up, I decided to work on some of the prep sanding. And sanding is my least favorite thing, but I think that's another thing that really sets most furniture guys that really get big apart is they take the time to sand appropriately. And if you know anything about sanding, then you can plainly see that I'm doing something I shouldn't. Sanding a part that is just too skinny, but I don't really care too much about that, and that's because of what I'm doing right now is I'm rounding over those edges. And that's the biggest problem with sanding small edges like that is that the sanding pad tends to curve a little bit. Even if you don't curve your hand at all, it will. But since I'm rounding over all the edges, I didn't think it mattered too much, and I couldn't really tell after the fact, so I'm not disappointed. And right here, this is the step that I was talking about, how I set up the router table for a future step. And I actually did have to come in and unset it up just to set it up again because I did it wrong. But luckily I caught it. And this is for a little dado just in the top of each of the base legs. And eventually I'm going to put in a little standoff piece that you'll see. But I needed to get that done before I glued them all together, or else I wouldn't be able to use the router table. And it was just going to be a lot easier to use the router table. And so order of operations is really important in woodworking. And so I try to do my best to think out every single step that I can. And now I am ready for the glue up. My biggest stress at this point was I felt like I was going to get one of the standoff dado parts on the bottom on accident. And luckily that didn't happen, but I did accidentally put one of those cross pieces in the bottom where it was supposed to be on the top. And so I guess you lose some, you win some. But in the long run, it all worked out and you can't see any gaps. So I'm pretty happy with that. If you noticed before I glued it up, when I was doing those roundovers, I purposefully didn't go all the way to the edge. And that was because I know that wood tends to tear out, especially near the end. And I knew I was going to be gluing it onto these cross members or X's that would also need to be rounded over. And so I decided that I would actually do that when everything was sanded down and glued up so that I could get it all at once with minimal chance of tear out. And that worked out really well, as you'll see a little bit later. But while I was gluing this up, I decided I would glue the top up. And I actually did end up getting a pretty good joint out of this, and I just had to take it back to the joiner and take off like 1/1/28th of an inch, like a very small amount, and just take it very slow so that I wouldn't get any tear out like I was that first attempt. And I don't think it's that my blades are dull because they're pretty new still, but something's definitely up there. The next day, I took everything out of the clamps and began working on the very, very tedious process of sanding. And for this, I believe I started right around 80 grit, which is fairly heavy, but I did have some pretty big, not quite gaps, but the measurements didn't quite add up just because I was using the router cross members versus what I'd already milled down and sanded, and so it just wasn't perfect, but it worked out in the long run. And now I'm going through, after sanding everything, which luckily for you, I forgot to record most of me sanding. I'm just going through and rounding over all of those edges, and this is one of my favorite steps of the whole process. When you get to kind of see it coming together is what's called a water pop. And I wouldn't say it's necessarily required, but it definitely does make for a better product. And now that that is all done and I'm letting it dry a little bit before I continue sanding onto 180, it's time to use the router sled. It This is just a DIY router sled, but it works pretty good with a trim router, but it does take a long, long time and leaves a lot of chatter marks. And so it's not the perfect solution, but this tabletop was just a little bit too big for my planer. And then I get to go on and trim up all of the edges with my track saw. And I love having this little square on the end. It doesn't beat a table saw, but mine was a little bit preoccupied being a workbench at the moment. So one of my next future projects is going to be building a new table saw stand that will actually work this time. And right here you get to see the wonderful adjustment of my router table as I'm prepping to round over the corners so that I can match the base with the top, because I don't want any sharp corners. So I just felt like this was a good step to get in there as well. And I just used that same exact template that I used for the base. Next up will be some of my favorite, once again, sanding. And this time I was just throwing the chalk on there, more for the fun of it, honestly, because I think I started around 80 and then I jumped down to 60 grit and even down to 40 just because the chatter marks were really bad and oak takes forever to sand. And so I was trying to cut out as much time as I could, and it worked out pretty good going down to 40 grit. Eventually, I made my way up to 120 grit, and that is when I did the round over on the top. And just same round over that I did on the base, did on the top. And I like to do that before I hit it with the final 180 grit, just because that way I can take out any marks that are left by the router or the bearing. And as I'm watching this video, I noticed that I forgot to sand the base. And so I went in and I fixed that. Everything's fine now, but I did forget to do that. So after I fixed the base, I went in and I'm working on the little bolt that I'm going to use to hold the top onto the base. And it just was very short, and so I had to take out a lot of material with those bits to make it so that it would reach the top. And next up is these little standoffs that I mentioned. And this is an idea that I actually got from Four Eyes Furniture. And I think it's called their spider table. How he has it kind of elevated just a little bit off of the legs. And I thought that that really put in a good just visual difference between the base and the top, and I liked how it turned out a lot on that table and even more on this table. It just really looks good in my opinion. Next up is the threaded insert so that furniture bolt can reach up into the top and hold it on there. And marking out where each of those standoffs is going to go. I tried a couple different methods just because I wasn't 100% sure how square the base was at this point. Turns out it was pretty much dead on. It needed a little bit of wiggling to get in there perfect, but I used this level to make a straight line between both sides, and my little same router bit that I used in the base for all of those dados just so that it could set in there and hold everything at a perfect 90. And after doing all this, I threw in that furniture bolt and I didn't like it. You can see it from the side, and so I just decided to almost make a walnut washer, I guess you could call it, to put on top of that so that you couldn't see it, even though it's not likely that you will see it because it's very low. You'd have to be pretty much crawling, but this was just more of in a time to explore, and so it was a good opportunity for me to try something else out. Once again, I love the water pop, being able to see all of that grain, and once it dried, it was on to 180 with the oak top. And again, this oak, it took the better part of an hour and a half to sand from 40 up to 180. It was a beast in its own, but it was well worth all the time spent sanding. But now it's on to sanding the base, and unlike the first time I sanded it doing the prep sanding, I didn't want to use my power sander just because it was going to round over those edges even more. And so it was all hand sanding at 180. And luckily it was just the one grit, but it definitely wasn't the funnest day. But putting in these little leveling pads, that was pretty fun actually to be able to have that. I build another type of table that I don't have those on, so I have to be very precise on the measurements. And it's just not very good, honestly. It takes a long time to get everything perfect, and that's if the floor is even level. But having leveling pads, or leveling feet, you could call them, it works out a lot better. And finally, on to the last step before assembling and getting pictures of it is just putting the finish on. And for this, I'm using Rubio Monocoat. It's a pretty well-known wood finish. And right here was a heart-stopping moment for a minute there. And I mean, looking back on it, yeah, it wouldn't have fallen very far, maybe a foot, because those 2x4s would have caught it. But in the moment, I felt like a superhero catching that. And I'm still glad I did, but it probably wouldn't have done any damage, honestly. When all was said and done, I think that this is one of my best pieces. I'm super proud of how it turned out, and if you guys liked it, then I'd love for you to subscribe and or like the video, as I hope to make this a full-time thing that I'm able to support my family off of and build custom furniture. So if any of you have any other ideas you'd like to see me build, leave a comment and stay tuned.